Hello, everybody. Thank you for showing up. So I'm going to talk about DNS, everybody's favorite, and how to make it, relevant in exploits and other things that are related to infrastructure that might be involved in attacks of different types. So dangling DNS, these are basically, records that have been either abandoned or misconfigured in some way. So I'm going to take you through the different meanings of how we can be exposed with dangling DNS records, what the risks are, how they can be exploited, and what kind of risks and negative consequences you can be exposed to. And this is all the way from things like taking over sessions and breaking into systems and distributing malware, for example, which we throughout infrastructure that looks like it's your own. So we're going to show some of the ways that we can find these records, from a defender's point of view, so that we can remove them. And then some of the examples of successful takeovers that we've performed using this information and these kind of techniques. So that's kind of the journey that we'll show today. So first, like the basics, what's a dangling DNS record? Essentially, it's just a record that's pointing to another record. So it's a chain of names, but it's a broken chain. So the target record that is pointed to doesn't actually exist. And so normally, there's nothing involved in that, and that name resolution chain just fails, and you get nothing. So if you type that into your browser, for example, you don't get any website or anything like that because the name resolution chain fails to resolve all the way. So that's why I think a lot of the dangling DNS records, they're not really considered a huge problem because they're just ignored because they're not normally active, and so resolution doesn't complete, and so it looks like there is no actual risk. But the hidden risk in this is that target record could actually come back alive for some reason, and we'll see a number of different reasons later on, how we might be able to bring back these target records. And so essentially what's happening then is that if we manage to bring back one of those target records, we can complete the name resolution chain, and then all of the name resolution process then completes to something that might be under our control, or it'll be outside of the control of the original owner of that resource. So the diagram there is something that I stole from Microsoft website. So it gives us a run through of the simple example, which is CNAMEs. So CNAMEs essentially is a DNS record that points to another name. Typically, it might point to an A record. It could point to another C name that then points to an A record as well. But CNAME record is kind of a virtual name that points somewhere else. So that's typically what everybody has in their mind when we talk about dangling DNS. But the same principle applies to other name chains. Things like name server names are name chains because the name server itself does not point directly to an IP address. It points to the name of a name server. Same with MX records and some other types. So, why is this a problem? Well, the record doesn't exist, but we can bring it back, or we might be able to bring it back. And there's a number of different ways that we might be able to do that. The record could be hijacked as well. If we manage to get one of these records, we can serve anything that we like. If it's a website, we can put up something with fake information, or we can use it as a distribution point for malware links, for example. It could be used in phishing links. Spear phishing attacks would be very efficient because, for simplicity, we can call it impersonation, but it's not actually impersonation because the link would be inside of the target's own domain. So all of the things that he's been trained to look for, all of his end users have been trying to look for suspicious links. But this one is not suspicious because it's actually in the same domain that the user is normally using. Things like content management systems that are in place on the user's network, they don't have any effect because they're not able to detect links that are inside of the target domain. And so we can take this, very far, because if we are able to, let's say, impersonate, but present ourselves as a website within the domain scope of the target user, we also have a very high chance of having access to cookies that are sitting inside of the browser when it connects to us. So there could be session cookies in there. If they're in the domain scope and we're on a subdomain level, the browser might be willing to reveal those cookies to us if we can get into that name hierarchy. So the consequences are actually, pretty severe in the end, right? So some types, CNAME, we mentioned, that's the most common one, but there are many others, like name servers and MX records. They work in a similar way, like all of this points to A records or quad A records, depending on the IP type. We have some other types as well. I'm just, in this talk here, I'm just going to look at the first 2 or 3 different types. But there are other types as well. So things like SPF includes. SPF is a specially formatted type of text record, but it's used in email validation. And there could be things embedded in there that are no longer valid or that could be hijacked as well. And because it's part of the validation chain in email communications, we might be able to effectively impersonate email, and we'll pass all of the validation controls that are in place. The last 2, A and quad A records, they're not pointing to names, but they're pointing to IPs. But they can be dangling as well, and that's typically in cloud environments where A records are set up. If you start up a virtual machine, you get an IP address. Then if you set up an A record to support that and to point to that IP address by name, you now have a DNS entry. If you shut down the virtual machine and start it up again, there's a very high chance that you're getting a different IP address the next time. So now your A record is out of sync with reality, but someone else might be using the same cloud provider, starting up his own VM, and he's now allocated the IP address that pointed to your previous A record. So now you've lost control of that one. Again, this is outside of the scope of the name change that I'm going to talk about today, but these are important to be aware of as well from a defender's point of view. So the risks, obviously, we can take over a target website, and then we can do whatever that website might be doing, or we can do any of those other things that now look like completely legitimate traffic. Name servers as well, we can take over maybe partial or in some cases full control of a domain zone. And that gives us access to all of the records for that domain that is hosted there. And that means that we can either set up completely new records and redirect traffic anywhere we like. It could be that we could reconfigure or overwrite the configurations for records that are already there. So that's a really powerful attack if we are able to take over a name server and be able to direct all the traffic for a particular domain. MX records, they're specific to email, but if we can control one or more of those, we can also redirect email flow, and we'll be able to receive email and read it if we want. But also because the typical setup for email validation typically includes the MX record in SPF records. And that means that if we can take over control of an MX record, we also normally embedded inside of the validation chain, and that means that we can send outgoing email, acting as that particular target. So how do these things become dangling? Typically, there's a lot of common misconfigurations. In cloud services, it's very common that some automated provisioning is used, and sometimes that fails, and there's no rollback step, right? So it sets up part of the configuration, and then it fails, and then it doesn't remove things that are no longer valid. So that could happen if someone is doing it manually as well. Just forget to go back when configurations change. Simple things like using the wrong names or even spelling them wrong, that's very common. And probably more common than a lot of people think. So we have some examples of that here. So this is a simple misspelling configuration. This is a name server configuration. If we look at how name servers are resolved, we basically go to the root zone and look for the name hierarchy that eventually ends up pointing to the domain that we're interested in resolving. And there's some pointers to the name servers into this one. And so in this case, we have those servers on the left, and they point to a domain called melbourneIT.net. So the next thing that happens in the chain, and we're doing it here manually in this example, is that we can go to either one of those servers and ask specifically the same question, like what are the name servers for this domain that we're interested in? And in this case, when we do that, those name servers that we were told about in step 1, they're actually giving us different information. They're still giving us back Melbourne IT, but the guys in Melbourne forgot that Melbourne is spelled with an E at the end. So it's not there. So that's just a misspelling. But it gives us a completely new set of name servers. And in this case, those name servers don't actually exist because the Melbourne IT without the E has not been registered, which means that we can now register that. And now we're the owner of that domain, and now we can set up name servers that have the same names as the ones in the actual zone, but we can put in information on those name servers to be anything that we like, because we have total control of those. So in this case, we have a very good chance that we're eventually going to see almost all of the name resolution traffic for the target domain, which is actually neither of the Melbourne IT ones. It's actually actimi.com.au, because that's using those name servers as host for their domain zone. So name resolution traffic for actimi.com.au is very likely to end up on our fake name servers, very quickly. And then we can start feeding back, bad or misconfigured information or malicious information or redirects or anything that we like. So if we're trying to target any users in that domain, if we have control over the DNS zone, we can actually control any link that they click on inside of their domain. We can control any emails that is sent to them. We can see all of that traffic that happens. And then we can either do something actively with that or not. Like if we were trying to do a spear phishing attack, for example, it might be very efficient to set up for a short period of time some valid resolution for a clickable link inside of the target domain. And then once we're done, once we've hijacked a particular user, we can remove that record, and then it's no longer there. So it's very, it could be used for any time period that matches whatever activity that we want to carry out. So that's dangerous. Another example is to forget to clean up the cloud services. And so things like Azure have a load balancer service called trafficmanager.net. When you set up your records in there, you can point. The idea is that you point the record to wherever the endpoint is that you want to serve traffic from. And typically, in a lot of cases, those records are not cleaned up, but they remain available in Azure, and they're not bound to any particular customer. So there might be a timeout period where they can't be reused, but when that timeout period expires, anyone can basically set up an account, even a free account on Azure, try to create the same name that was there, left behind from before. It's no longer in Azure, but you can create it. And then whatever that was pointing to, originally, now effectively is under your control because you're now in that part of the name chain. So what we really want to do is we want to look at this from a defender's point of view, and we want to think about ways of how we can find all of these dangling DNS records so that we can prevent this problem from occurring in the first place. And this is a difficult problem, actually, because typically what you do is you'd have to check each record specifically to see if it resolves to an IP address. Like all traffic, as you know, on the network is, the name is just an abstraction. Like everything happens with IPs, and everything else on top of that is just an abstraction. So that means that all of the records that are in DNS of these relevant types eventually have to resolve to an IP address so that it becomes routable. So that's essentially what we need to do to check if this is a dangling record or not. In a simple case, we can just use dig and then put in the name, and then we can check that everything eventually resolves to an IP address. So the last line should always be an IP. And if that's the case, we can forget about that one. That's not a risk. That's a valid record. And we can move on and check the next one. But in the cases where we don't get an IP address back, we might end up with just a name, so at the one at the bottom. These are actually Microsoft records, and these are valid and active. And so one of those Microsoft records is actually a dangling record. So in this case, obviously, we can't dig into Microsoft's domain and take it over, but it's still an incomplete configuration. And we can see in this case, the name change doesn't lead to an IP address. So that would be what a dangling DNS record looks like. But if we were to do this in general, and even large organizations that have a lot of different zone files, they have a lot of different domains, they have a lot of different records, to be able to check each one by one, that's not actually a scalable approach. So from an attacker's point of view, there is a significant obstacle to be able to discover these records, and then it's basically a brute force attempt to try and resolve all of these names. So what we do is that we collect a lot of information to be able to, so one of the main purposes of what we do is we track attacker infrastructure as it's being set up. And that means that we have to have a very good view of what's happening on the internet, including things like DNS changes and stuff like that. So we have a very large data collection platform, and one of the things that we collect is DNS information through active resolution. And that gives us basically a database full of all of the DNS records that exist every day on the internet. So this is a big data collection task that is running continuously. So we have a better way of actually finding these DNS records because we now have all this data stored in our data collection. We can basically just group them into different types, and then we can reduce the whole problem to a set problem. And essentially what we can do with this is that we can just calculate the partition symmetric difference between the different record sets that are relevant to the dangler type that we're looking at. So in the case of a CNAME dangler, they should all resolve to either other A records or quad A records, essentially. And so basically what we do is we just take all the CNAMEs and then subtract all of the A records because ideally that should resolve to an empty set. There should be nothing left once we've subtracted all of those. But obviously that's not the case, right? So we end up with a set that contains CNAMEs that didn't point to any other name that we can resolve. And so that remaining set, those are the dangling records for that record type. And so we can use the same techniques with name server records and MX records and a few of the other ones as well. So now we have an actual active data set containing all of the dangling records that exist for each of those types. And so this is a significant step up in tooling from the brute force approach, right? So from the attacker's point of view, he'd have to resolve all of these and figure out the process of doing that at scale. And that's why when we look around and see someone who's attempted to do that, like some of the biggest result sets that we've seen is someone who's managed to produce maybe a list of, let's say, 50,000 or so CNAMEs that are dangling. And then, if it's a bounty hunter, he can try and take them over and see if he can make some money out of that. So our target here is we want to see if we can do better than finding 50,000 dangling CNAME records. And so yes, we can. So actually, if we're doing it this way, we end up with more than 2 million CNAME records that are dangling. And these are, many of these can potentially be taken over. And I'll show you some examples here shortly. Again, more than 2 million MX records also. and almost 300,000 name servers. So there's a huge amount of risk associated with this, because from the attacker's point of view, we are now really in a target-rich environment. If the attacker had this data set, he'd just start from the top and then start hijacking things all over the place. And if he's doing spear phishing campaigns, he would have a very, very valuable data set to be able to produce very convincing links, because they're not actually detectable by any of the countermeasures that we know of or are used to using. Right? And so one of the things that we can now do is that we can start auditing this, and we can mine them. And so obviously we're looking at this from a defensive point of view. So each domain should be able to see what's happening inside of their scope. And one of those things is to go and look for them through an auditing tool, but also monitoring as well. When we're counting these up of the different types, are there any changes through from week to week, or from day to day, or month to month? And each of those change events would be of note, right? So if the number goes up, okay, we have a new dangling record. If the number goes down, there could be a couple of reasons for that. Either we started cleaning it up, which is a good thing, or the actual record has been hijacked by someone else. And that would be not so good. But not knowing about that is the worst thing that's the worst situation you can be in. So being able to monitor this is really important. And so the specific examples we have here is I think it's Equinix, yeah. The count of dangling MX record has decreased by 1 from last week. That's because we managed to take it over. So there's now 1 less dangler. It's inside of our control, but ideally it should be under the domain owner's control. So these are some of the examples, and I have a few slides with some of the real-world takeovers that I can show. But you're going to recognize some of the domain names on this slide, right? And all of these records that you see here, these are now controlled by us. In this case, that's better than being controlled by an attacker, right? I would say. But these are of different types. We have CNAMEs. We have CNAMEs pointing to third-party services and cloud hosting and stuff like that. We have email traffic, and we have control of some name server zones as well. So one of the examples that mentioned before was taking over abandoned cloud services. And this is one from Ford here. So again, this is a cloud service. We insert ourselves in the name chain by taking over an abandoned cloud resource, and then eventually the name resolution chain points to our hosting page, and we just have the little announcement down the end. So, but that's just our banner page. It could be anything, like it could be a fully spoofed page inside of the Ford domain, and it would look and act exactly like a valid Ford domain. And I'll show you an example as well, how we're able to get valid SSL certificates for these domains as well. So the way that this one works in Traffic Manager in Azure is that you just set up an account and you just type in the name and point it to your site. And that's it. That's all you have to do. You don't even have to buy any domain names. It's already there. You can do that for free. So the next one is maybe of local interest here. It's oxjam.com, and this is associated with Oxfam. So it used to be a site that was used to host benefit concert. It's a few years ago now, so it's no longer active, but the domain still exists. It still has records pointing somewhere. So the problem in this case is that it points to a domain that doesn't exist. So it points to a domain called Oxfam hosted. And so we can buy that. And that means that all of the traffic for oxjam.org now comes to us. So, okay, we spent $1.99 buying that domain, so it's not free, but it's still affordable, right? So now we have the entire the entire record for this website, and we can configure our own web server to host this. We can start just with a basic, simple HTTP configuration on the web server, because that's what we need to be able to get an SSL certificate from Let's Encrypt. That's part of their validation. So we start that up first, then we use the command line tool from Let's Encrypt to request the certificate. And it's very useful because it automatically reconfigures our basic Nginx configuration to integrate the certificate. It'll automatically upgrade all incoming connections to SSL. And now we have a completely valid certificate inside of oxjam.org. Anything that the user checks in his browser, clicks on the little padlock, and oxjam.org is a valid certificate. And we didn't even buy oxjam.org. We bought a seemingly unrelated domain that just happens to be in the name resolution chain that is associated with this record. So we don't have to mess with the zone file for oxjam.org. We're not touching that at all. We're doing something completely separate from that. But still, we now have a certificate inside of oxjam.org that is entirely valid. And we can see that we get traffic into our server here. So one of the things that I think companies assume, or organizations assume generally, is that, well, we'll just pay someone to manage this problem for us and it'll go away. There's lots of people that will take your money to do something, but it's not always clear exactly to the buyer what they get for their cash. So in this case, we definitely did not get protection against DNS takeover, because this oxjam.org domain is actually registered and managed by one of the brand protection companies, but we still managed to take over the records and get valid certificates inside of that domain. Right? And we can keep going, because now we have that domain that was in the name server chain. Now we can just go in reverse and see what else is pointing there, because we spent $2, right? So what else can we get out of it? And so we get a few other ones as well. But the thing that becomes interesting is when we get to things like cookies that sits in the browser inside of the domain scopes. This is another example where we have a subdomain inside of a fully operating domain. And if we look inside of the cookie settings in the browser, we can see that the cookies are actually hosted inside of the domain scope in the browser setting. But it's revealed to us because we're on the subdomain level. So if there's no other restrictions in there, we can actually see the cookies directly. And then we can start looking for what they might be, and we can start recording them in our log file. And we just need a simple addition to our server configuration, and then all of the cookies from the user's browser, when he connects to our site, which is not related to the original site in any way other than we're inside of the same namespace, the browser now reveals all the cookies to us. So that means that we can build a stealthy drive-by cookie stealer. And we don't even need to write any code for this. We need to write maybe a little bit of HTML, 2 or 3 lines. Make it look like a clickable link in an email, for example. And these are all maskable, right? They don't need to reflect where you're actually clicking. That's all inside of the link itself. So what happens here is that we can make it look like anything. When he clicks on it, he actually ends up on our server. But on our server, what we want to do is to receive the cookies and then redirect it immediately, so the user doesn't actually see what is happening in the background. So in diagram format, it looks like this. Like the user sees what's in blue, and he thinks that he's talking to the website in green. But what's actually happening is that it's a fake link that actually redirects down to the orange section, which is under our control. It drops all of the cookies that are available inside of that namespace, leaves them there, and then because we control that server, we can now use those cookies to actually steal the session that the user was using on the target site. So that's it. I have a quick demo that can run while you think about any questions you might want to ask later on. I think I'm out of time, so
yeah, thank you very much,
find me
John.
Yeah.
We are out of time, but please, we're going to have a lunch break in a half an hour, so I'm sure you'll be around to answer any questions you have, and please approach John later and ask those. And if we can get a round of applause for a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.